welcome to Planning for Equity. It's a joint program, as Brandon mentioned, of the American Planning Association's Illinois Diversity Committee and the APA Chicago Metro section. I'm Marcella Bondi Keenan. I'm the chair of the Diversity Committee, and I'm also tonight's moderator. So tonight's program will be a panel discussion and a Q&A from 3 to 5 p.m. With a networking event immediately following. And I hope you'll stay for the networking to continue the conversation with students from the Society for Black Urban Planners, El Poder, the Latino Planning Organization for Development, Education, and Regeneration, and Women in Planning and Public Administration. I'd like to also thank our host, Dr. Cordova, and the Great Cities Institute, and our partners, the UIC Kappa Alumni Association and the UIC Urban Planning and Policy Student Association. I would also like to acknowledge the recent passing of a UIC student, Alma Samurio, who is active in El Poder and who advocated for social justice issues. I'm certain Alma would be very pleased to see so many people here today. So now I'd like to introduce each of our panelists. We'll hear from each panelist about how equity shapes their work and then move into a discussion. Okay, so first we have Ciara Boatwright. Ciara is a project manager of real estate for Chicago Neighborhood Initiatives, responsible for retail and housing developments. Ciara received a bachelor's degree from Hamilton College and a master's in urban planning from the University of Illinois. Ciara is active in the civic space and was recently appointed as commissioner for the Roseland Medical District, and is also an ethical redevelopment salon session member at the University of Chicago's Place Lab.
So this first question is to address how equity shapes our work. Awesome. So I'll just tell a little bit more kind of about what we do at CNI and my role at CNI and the kind of impact that we've had in primarily underserved communities. And I stress the underserved communities because in planning, often development in underserved communities are overlooked, which is why they're underserved. CNI is a not-for-profit community development corporation, very much mission-driven. We work in Pullman with the holistic approach to development, and I'll go in a little bit more detail with kind of our work there, but we also work in Inglewood, in Bronzeville, specifically to eliminate food deserts. So you guys probably are familiar with the Whole Foods in Inglewood. CNI was a site and infrastructure developer for that, and the Marianos in Bronzeville on 39th and King, CNI was one of the developers for that. So again, our work is to eliminate food deserts in those communities, but in Pullman, we have a far more holistic approach. Many of you guys may know Pullman's on the far south side of Chicago and has been disinvested for years and years, decades, I should say. And so what we realize as a nonprofit organization is we have assets in Pullman, assets that are often overlooked. And part of our planning and part of our work has been about leveling the playing field, if you will, and create more resources, jobs, and opportunities on Chicago's far south side. And so in Pullman, for example, we've done that by job creation. We've created over 750 jobs in the area. Most of those jobs have actually gone to local residents. And that's really one point that we like to stress, because you can create industry, but if all the hires come from, I don't know, north of Roosevelt Road, are you really creating equity? And so we work hard to make sure that the opportunities that we create are the folks that live in the area are directly benefited. In the last 7 years, we've invested over $250 million. We've helped to coordinate investment of around $250 million in the form of Method, which is a green cleansing soap factory. We call it the Southside Soapbox. We have Whole Foods Distribution Center that's coming to Pullman. It's now a national monument, so we're developing the visitor center in Pullman and working on housing. So in general, we're working directly with the residents to respond to the needs. And we'll talk about this and kind of throughout the panel, how we've been responsive to the needs of the community to really shape equity and kind of level the playing field on the south side.
Thank you. So our next panelist is Tamika Christian. Tamika is a program officer at Local Initiative Support Corporation, or LISC. Tamika is responsible for supporting communities with creating and implementing quality of life plans. The QLP is a participatory process that has allowed disinvested communities to have a voice in planning and visualizing positive change that they want to see in their community. Tamika is currently working on her doctoral degree in community psychology at National Louis University.
So thank you. So I guess I'll start with LISC and what it is. So LISC overall is a national organization, and we're in 32 cities and rural areas across the country. And what LISC does is it's a community development financial institution. So we're known for providing financial resources for community development corporations and also non-for-profit and for-profit entities to invest in underserved communities. And we also have a small business lending side. So my specific role is working in neighborhoods and making sure that neighborhoods are created or built for, I'm sorry, my thoughts are getting jumbled, but making sure that the neighborhoods have a voice in the planning that's taking place. And so we call those quality of life plans. And historically, if you read about the history of planning in Chicago, you'll see in 2005, LISC embarked on an ambitious endeavor, and they did 14 quality of life plans at once. And so we were in 14 neighborhoods throughout this planning process. We partnered with MacArthur Foundation, and they did significant investment. And what they attempted to do was see how could you change the landscape of neighborhoods with a significant investment, financial support, and leveraging resources of what was taking place. And so we coined that and said we're doing quality of life plans. To date, we don't have the level of support that we used to, so we do about 3 quality of life plans a year, and we work in neighborhoods. And the way we create equity in communities is, it's simple. You take the assets there and look at the opportunities. The communities we're in, you hear about the negative things, but there are lots of assets there. There are lots of people there that are in these communities that are engaged in the work, and they have a vision for their community. So through identifying a lead organization who is a stakeholder in a community but also works collaboratively in their efforts, we identify organizations to lead the effort of creating a plan and convening others to be invested in this plan. And together, they have a vision for their community. Sometimes you hear that people may not have a vision for what they want, but we realize that the people are the assets of the community, and we build through grassroots organizing. We help those people with supporting, and we bring in planners, we bring in facilitators, we bring in a whole gamut of people to provide resources to support with the planning process. And the planning process usually takes between a year and 18 months. And then we don't just exit the community, we are there with them for implementation of the plan. And we have public and private partnerships locally and nationally to help bring resources to the community.
Tamika. So next we have Kimberly Porter. Kimberly Porter is an AICP and program manager in the planning department at the Regional Transportation Authority. She previously served as Director of Economic and Community Development for the Village of University Park, Illinois, in which she worked on projects such as the successful negotiation of relocating Clorox from Georgia to University Park. Kimberly's focus areas include policy and program implementation related to land use, regional and sustainable community development, and access to transit. She has been a member of the APA for over 10 years, and she received a bachelor's degree in sociology with an emphasis in urban studies from North Central College in Naperville, Illinois, and a master's degree in urban planning and policy from the University of Illinois at Chicago.
Thank you. I'm not sure if I'm the Lone Ranger who has a little bit more of a municipal planner perspective on social equity. I think in these turbulent times of widening income inequality, racial tensions, and soaring housing prices, as a planner, I always try to, a goal of mine is to provide solutions, or at least not exacerbate these larger social issues. I think as a planner, one thing that we need to be cognizant of when we're thinking about social equity is the plans that we write and how we create them. It is important to think about the stakeholder and their role in this, because truly, the outcome of those plans can both have positive and negative outcomes within your respective community, point blank. And as a planner, just thinking about just ethically, whether you are AICP or not, and we'll talk about this further, I think, throughout our discussion and presentations, we all have an ethical responsibility to think about social equity for the communities that we plan for, whether we are consultants, whether we're the municipal planner, whether we are a participant in the planning process. And I think that gets lost in translation for a lot of people. When you are just a participant within a respective planning process, you also have social equity responsibilities that a lot of people don't realize. And so, again, for me, I try to approach social equity as it being in the forefront, and I'm cognizant of it, and I try to always think about it when it's time for me to educate my executive director currently, who thankfully is also an urban planner, or when I'm in a more local municipality role, educating the stakeholders on the planning process, the elected officials. As we all know, as times change, government, people are in and out, and it's important to keep our boards and commissions and our elected officials abreast of planning issues and the importance of thinking about social equity.
So next we have Elizabeth Scott. Elizabeth is an associate planner for the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, where she works on housing and economic development planning and policy. Prior to CMAP, Elizabeth was a program officer at the Chicago Rehab Network, focusing on affordable housing policy and advocacy. She holds a bachelor's degree in liberal arts from St. John's College and a master's of urban planning and public affairs from UIC. She is a member of the American Institute of Certified Planners and a former president of Women in Planning.
Hello, everyone. As Marcella said, I'm Elizabeth Scott, and talking about my experience in equity as a planner with you before I joined you here, I took it back a little bit further than some of the other panelists. I wanted to share just a little bit about myself and my background, and kind of how that led me to be here today. So I'm from Richmond, Virginia, which is a differently but also still very segregated place. My mom worked in fair housing, and my dad worked at legal aid, so I grew up with those kinds of conversations happening all around me and in my life, and that led me to planning school here at UIC, where I worked in both the Voorhees Center and the Center for Urban Economic Development before going on to Chicago Rehab Network. And at the Chicago Rehab Network, which is a coalition of nonprofit affordable housing developers, I helped think about policies, provide technical assistance, and do research to help communities make their own decisions, and particularly preserve and acquire or build more affordable housing and other kinds of community supports. So in that role, I worked on the most recent update to the Affordable Requirements Ordinance from a research and position paper and lobbying standpoint. I also worked on the renewal of the statewide donations tax credit, sometimes called the Illinois Affordable Housing Tax Credit. So that type of experience, and which is wonderful. About a year and a half ago, I joined CMAP, where I'm lucky enough to still work on those kinds of issues, but also more additional things. So as a staff member in the local planning department, I get to work on projects in communities across the region. As you all, I'm sure, know, CMAP is the metropolitan planning organization for the Chicago region, serving the 7 counties surrounding Chicago. That's about 300 municipalities and many units of government. So we have a staff of about 100 people, and we do a lot of things. And so I work both in local communities, like for instance, Tamika and I are working on comprehensive neighborhood planning process in North Lawndale right now, as well as, so local communities, as well as lending some policy support and research to the things that CMAP is doing for our Onto 2050 comprehensive regional plan. We make a new one about every 10 years, and it incorporates new thinking, best practices, revisions to our work, things that we've learned, and basically lays out a roadmap for what the agency is going to do, and thinking about consequences over a long time horizon, in this case 2050. So I'm the project manager for our inclusive growth strategy, which I see many of you picked up our strategy paper. Thank you. I hope that you read it and ask us if you have any questions or comments or ideas. In a nutshell, our position on inclusive growth is that the current state of the literature and science in planning and policy is that we, as communities, need to invest in disinvested areas and create pathways to opportunity for people who are not currently benefiting from all of the prosperity that's happening in our region and across our country, and that by doing so, we won't just accomplish something that's good in and of itself, but we'll be able to create a broader aggregate prosperity and more assured future for the whole region. Because the research, I think, pretty conclusively shows now that places that have less economic and racial inequality tend to have longer periods of growth, more sustained periods of growth, growth in more sectors. These are all things that everybody in this region needs for a assured future. So we have to think about it not as a niche practice or something that we shouldn't think about it as a strategy that isn't needed for comprehensive planning, because it is. Planning for opportunity for everybody needs to be at the center of what we all do as planners, and that's how we're thinking about it at CMAP, because inclusive growth will be one of 3 principles of the Onto 2050 plan. So what that means is that it will be expressed in every category of strategies, and we're working right now to think about how we can meaningfully include that framework in everything that we do as an agency. So we're really excited about that, and we hope to collaborate with many, if not all, of the people in this room, moving that series of action strategies and thought forward.
So our last but not least, our panelist is Dawn Thompson. Dawn Thompson is Director of Rain Ready Community at the Center for Neighborhood Technology. And prior to C&T, Dawn also worked at the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning as a water resources planner on the local technical assistance program. Dawn holds a bachelor's degree in environmental science from Dominican University and is actively involved in the American Water Works Association.
Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I just wanted to talk a little bit about kind of my work that I've done and somewhat of my interest with regard to this subject. As Marcella mentioned, I feel that I've had an opportunity to work on both the municipal side and also to work basically on a neighborhood scale with a lot of the work that I've done. Previously, I was able to complete a number of comprehensive plans addressing environmental issues, and so that was near and dear to my heart. So the thing that, when I made the transition to work with the Center for Neighborhood Technology, I was primarily interested in implementation of a number of the plans and recommendations that are outlined in the comprehensive plans. And so I feel that I had a chance to kind of work in both directions. The program that I oversee now at the Center for Neighborhood Technology, which is a nonprofit agency based in Chicago, dealing with both regional scale issues, and also we also work, it's a non-for-profit as I mentioned, but also working in other cities. The program, it's called Rain Ready, and essentially it is a program designed to help residents who are interested in addressing climate change specific to flooding in their community. A study was done by the agency and for the Cook County, and determined that a number of communities that experienced the most adverse amount of flooding were in communities that just didn't have the financial resources to address that, a number of communities on the south side of Chicago. And so that really struck me as very interesting. And those communities just don't have the resources, or the attention hasn't been brought to those communities to address a number of the issues that they were facing. So the program that I oversee, it basically deals with dealing with and completing plans to address flooding on a community level, dealing with specific neighborhoods, and also it takes it a bit further by dealing with residential homeowners on an individual case-by-case basis. So home upgrades are offered to a number of residents based on their flooding issues. And then the portion that I oversee is basically, I feel that we're almost as if I'm a connector, because I'm able to help provide resources that residents perhaps in neighborhoods don't have, with resources national at some times. And so I feel that a lot of attention needs to be brought to these disinvested communities, and so that I feel that that is my role, to be able to bridge that gap and to provide those resources and to bring that type of attention to residents who would otherwise not have that.
Thank you, Dawn. Okay, so now I'd like to move it into the discussion part, and I'm going to start with the big question. So basically, as planners, how can we use community planning to address disinvestment and to increase equity in communities? Very big question.
So I think that it's not easy. I think it's important to be intentional. And I'll start with the community engagement, it's the very beginning of the process. And I'll give a concrete example. At CNI, about 8 years ago now, before we devised any plan, we actually talked to the residents. We not just talked, I mean, we engaged for an entire year, over 60 community meetings. These are small meetings with 3 to 4 people to larger meetings with 100 people, just to get different voices in the room. Did it take a long time? Absolutely. Was it worth it? Absolutely. And I think it's important to note that before there were any plans made, we were listening. So we actually did listening sessions. Tell us what you want to see here. Tell us what you think are our strengths in the area. What are our weaknesses? What are our threats? Where are the opportunities? From those conversations, there was a few themes that came up. And I'm just giving an example to kind of stress the need for long, deep, wide kind of conversations. There were a few themes that came up. Pullman was one of the city's largest food deserts. Residents said, we're literally starving. We need healthy food options. We go to the gas station for a gallon of milk, or we get on the expressway and leave our neighborhood just for groceries. The second theme was we need jobs badly, living wage jobs. The third theme was we need retail service. Outside of groceries, we just can't fulfill like basic needs. We can't go to dry cleaners because there's no dry cleaner in the area. In terms of like restaurants, there's nowhere to eat. We're leaving our community for everything. In addition to the retail, they said recreation would be wonderful. We need somewhere for our youth to have year-round access to safe, supervised play. The fourth theme was affordable housing. So those were the things that we heard. And I think it's important to note from listening to these folks, CNI didn't come in and say, hey, based off our experience, this is what will work well in the community. Instead, we said, here's a blank slate. What do you need? Where should it go? How should it look? Who should build it? Who should be involved? What should we require from the businesses that decide to come here? How can we support the small businesses that are here that maybe want to have space in some of these retail spaces. So for us, it's important to be, again, intentional. I think as planners, as developers in our case, to be intentional and be deliberate. If you really want to engage past the kind of check the box engagement, to say I kind of held a community meeting so I can get through city council, you have to plan. Take the time. Don't work against a deadline. Okay, we got 3 weeks to get a few community meetings in, because it won't be authentic and it'll feel unauthentic. So I would say take the time, be deliberate, be transparent, and be prepared for resistance. No matter how great you think your intentions are, we're a local community developer, but we don't live there. And so, for many residents, we can be deemed as an outsider. So I think it's important for people to become comfortable. Schedule meetings when people can actually show up. Don't do a 2:00 p.m. meeting on a Wednesday. Just be really intentional and authentic. And I think that helps to kind of broaden your audience. That helps to make sure that you have all the stakeholders that need to be present there. I think having multiple meetings, if you have to knock on doors and say, we've had 10 meetings and we have not heard from anyone on this block. When's your next block club? Can we just come? We want to get a feel of kind of what you're thinking. And I don't think it stops at the planning process. You engage through implementation. You go back after whatever you're developing, in our case, is build and say, did we do it right? Because we got plans to do more. How can we do it differently? And I think if you're authentic and you are deliberate, the engagement won't stop once the brick and mortar is done. So just from my experience, I think be prepared for long-term conversations.
Do we want to pass it down the row, or just we want to? Okay, we can pass it down. Yeah, Tamika, that's a great idea. Everybody clustered in the back. Why don't you just come down and sit in these free chairs in the front? If that, and we're just having a conversation. It's cool. There's some more over there. A couple more over here. Yeah, sitting on the floor, totally cool, no problem. Yeah. Sorry. Oh, no, I was thinking the same thing. So the question is, how can we address disinvestment and promote equity in communities? Okay. So I think, first off, everything you said again. And some other aspects that I'd like to address, just kind of things that I've noticed through my work, is another important thing, which is also present in your comments, is the importance of partnerships. And something that organizations like ours, who are kind of active in the space and know who the partners are, something we can do is talk to community, try and figure out what are the challenges that people are facing, and understand them in a real way, not in a pro forma cookie cutter way, like, is it because you're poor? I mean, there's lots of different forms of disinvestment, lots of different ways that it plays out, but if you've done the work to try and understand what people are facing, and you have a good inventory of who does what in the civic, public, and government space, then you can start to make those connections and have the conversations that can help you get to what are the gaps, what are the barriers, and what are easy things that we can do now, like, is this a disinvested suburban municipality that has antiquated development regulations that totally prohibit the type of thing that you're trying to do? Can we make sure that the rules that are easy to change are changed, and that we're focusing energy on thinking about difficult barriers and assembling partners who have the ability and resources to start to address things in a systematic way?
So again, I'm going to agree with what they said and pass the mic. No, just kidding. So I would say be intentional about building relationships, making people aware of who you are and why you're doing what you're doing. Form partnerships, but the key word that I said a few moments ago was be relational. And when you're intentional about being relational, you meet people where they are. So, for example, and again, LISC is in multiple communities, so we're working different avenues in different communities. So it's not all about creating a plan. It may be about doing a development in a particular neighborhood and being a good partner, but being relational with the community. And what that means is, sometimes people don't know how to organize, and it's being able to afford that opportunity or provide them that opportunity to learn and grow, and that space to learn and grow. And so you may go into a neighborhood where they've organized and they've addressed the issue like foreclosure, and then you go into another neighborhood where they just want to plan, and they don't know how to get there. They don't know what organizing looks like for them. And so you meet the communities that you're serving where they are, and you be really intentional about forming that relationship. And when you're in a relationship, it's long term. I mean, as I said, we're in 2005, LISC created or supported with those 14 plans. And guess what? We're still in every single neighborhood after all of those years later, processing, working with them, trying to see what the next steps are, even revisiting those plans to say, is it time to renew your plan or update your plan? And it's about not taking sides, but also looking at how can we leverage? Because, I mean, let's be real about it. We're in the city of Chicago, and things happen in neighborhoods that may not have community input. But then it's about leveraging what can the community benefit from this development coming into their neighborhood, and what are those needs of the community. So I would say that those things are necessary to be successful with the plan.
How do I add to all of this? For planners who are currently employed as a consultant, currently employed municipally, or will be in the future, it goes back to that not trying to cram in your mandatory stakeholder meeting within that 2-3 week period. That needs to be at the forefront. And again, that's an education component that you, as the planner, as the professional, need to educate your village manager, city administrator, whomever you report to, on the importance of that. And it is being creative, I think, too. It is, with the onset of social media, public notice has gone beyond the newspaper and putting something up in the pretty little bulletin board that you may have in your respective community. Now we're able to post things on Facebook, but believe there are some people that don't do Facebook, people. They don't go onto Facebook, they don't go onto Snapchat and Twitter. They won't see that notice, and how do you reach out to that? And that's a part of your responsibility in being creative in creating those networks. And as the planner, particularly for a community, it's important to have a pulse and understand who the players are in the community. You want to be the friend, I'm going to say this, in case I ever work with any of you in the future, you have to check me on this. You want to be the friend of the one that irritates you at that community, that municipal meeting, because that's the one that knows everybody, especially when you're in a small community of 8,000, 9,000 people, 10,000, and you got Ms. Johnson that stands up at every council meeting complaining. She's at every plan commission, ZBA meeting, historic preservation, and design review meeting. That's the one you need to have in your back pocket, because she's going to spread the word of what's going on. That she'll be your champion, or she'll be your biggest enemy. But nonetheless, you'll get feedback from her and the greater community. So again, it's being intentional and understanding who you're dealing with and who your audience is, and making that, just like you need a site plan, you need ZBA, plan commission approval, stakeholder approval, participation should also be a part of the top 3 or 4 things you need to do on that checklist. It cannot be an afterthought. Again, not having that 2 p.m. meeting, most people work. Maybe you have a 2 p.m. meeting at the local senior development because the seniors are there. That's where you have your 2 o'clock meeting. But you need to have a 7 o'clock, 8 p.m. meeting for others. For me, municipal planning, I just have to go. I didn't live in my respective community. I have to drive out on a Saturday when I want to be at the mall or playing golf. I've had to speak at church functions to garner support to obtain stakeholder input Saturday at 1 o'clock when I might want to watch football with friends. So it's that being intentional and being creative and thinking about ways of engaging residents, because that's where you get a lot of quality feedback. So those are things just to remember and keep that at the forefront. When you go back to your job, make a note. Where do we include stakeholder input? And do we do it more than once? How effective was those last 2 meetings? Can we build in an extra meeting here or there? So it's important, because that's when you start to have those quality, dynamic conversations. And I think that's where you get the proper input that is needed from everyone for a project to be successful. Because the whole point of having a pretty building built and only a select few can benefit from it.
I don't quite know how to follow that. But I concur with everyone on the panel here about just kind of being intentional. And as you mentioned, I find sometimes that you do have to kind of go outside of just the typical, we have 3 weeks to do this or 3 weeks to that. You know, for instance, I know that there are a lot of communities, for instance, the Latino community, maybe there's a sense of mistrust at the planning level. So what you might have to do is actually go to some of those community events to intentionally show that you're vested and that you're a part. And then a lot has to do too, in my opinion, with, you know, as planners, we can write a plan. We know we have to collect data sets. We know all of the technical things that we need to do. But a lot has to do with heart too, I feel, because if you're really interested in helping a community and you're really interested in, you know, you want to bring more investment to this community, then just your whole attitude, you will kind of take it the extra step in order to be involved, to engage, and to educate. And as you mentioned, I know that you were talking about the program, and you've developed a number of plans, and you're still involved in the planning process, and you're kind of still involved in the community. Residents, they know that, and that word gets around. And so then others will have more interest in being invested in your planning process too.
Okay, great, thanks. So we talked a little bit about outsiders. How do we use the planning process and leverage it to overcome negative views that outsiders might have about that community that you're working with, which could be contributing to disinvestment and inequities?
Well, I guess I have the mic, so I'll you know, I think that when I think about disinvestment, I think a lot of times that communities have been basically dehumanized. So at that point, when it gets to that point, it's no longer about an individual person or seeing a person. It's, you know, you just see a situation. I started to think about an example. I know that a lot of times, for instance, maybe you might see on television a child is missing, and you always hear the parent kind of speaking the language and saying, you know, this is my child, here is their picture, this is what, you know, has happened to them, please help, because you put a face to whatever that tragedy may be. So I feel that with bringing resources to various communities, it's important to let residents tell their story. I found out that to be very successful. I'll give you an example. There was a community on the south side of Chicago, had a lot of flooding issues. Because it's in their basements, it's not overland flooding, then there was no attention being brought to that community. But we were able to gather and have a number of residents kind of come to the table and actually tell their stories and tell how much they lost on their property and how it affected them, how it affected their health. And actually tell that story to some of the decision makers and some of the folks that would make the economic decisions in the community. And it basically put a face and it humanized people in that were dealing with that issue. And I think it's important that we as planners, you know, I know that we sit and we listen to residents kind of tell what they might like, but it's important to put a face to a community and allow residents to tell their story. I think that's very important. And then another thing, I think it's important that we kind of show the business community how they would be able to leverage and the resources that are actually there in the community that maybe they don't see. Historically, maybe there are things that there's a picture that could be told from a historical vantage point. Also, perhaps pointing out numbers. You know, there are this many residents in the community. Because they don't have the amount of jobs, this is the amount of money that could be brought to the community and brought to the region. But because these things are missing, we don't have that amount of money. So those are things that might be able to attract businesses to that community and just change the face and make that community, don't dehumanize the community.
Touching on the business community, for planners that are tasked with economic development, I mean, a lot of us know that it's extremely hard, and coercing the business community to come into these areas that may not be the North Shores of the world, the Highland, you know, the Highland Parks, the Skokies, the Lake Forests of the world. How do you induce those type of businesses that you know would potentially flourish, maybe on a smaller scale, in that particular community? It's extremely difficult, and I would say to planners that, again, it's about telling your story and telling it differently. If you go to something like deal making with the International Council of Shopping Centers, you go there, you give them your, from my experience, you go there, you give them your community's information. They'll pull your community information up. Oh, well, you're missing this, and this. We're looking for this demographic, this income. We're looking for this type of location. Planners, you need to be prepared to counteract that. A lot of times you'll go to these deal-making events, and they'll already tell you, we're looking to put a Starbucks in these communities only. Combat that. Talk about some of the things that you're doing in the community. You need to get the buy-in of your elected officials. Drag an elected official to some of those economic development events, because sometimes it's easy for them to sit there and say, I need you to get this, and this is what we want to see in the community. It's another's when they're there with you and they're seeing the process. And that was a benefit for me, is that I would have, as a director, I would have the mayor, well, we want to see a Starbucks, and we want a sauna, and we want a lifestyle fitness, and they want all these things. And it wasn't until they were there with me and they saw what went into that, and they had to take a step back. And it's about telling your story and telling your story differently beyond census numbers, because these developers are, and it's their job. They want to put something there. They want to make money. They want to know these businesses will flourish. What can you do? How can you be creative? How can your community be creative with financing, location assistance, telling your story differently? It's not always about throwing money at them. It's about showing them the community assets. You just need one. Sometimes you just need one business to start the rolling effect. It takes one. Sometimes you may have to go, maybe I can't have a Starbucks, but maybe we can bring in a smaller coffee house that will be just as successful. It's about thinking and redefining and recreating your respective community in order to be able to achieve those results. And it's not easy. Many of you know it's not easy, or will know it won't be easy. But it's a constant education component. It's that constant making sure that you learn how to tell your story. You have to be a good storyteller. You have to be a good seller. You have to be a jack of all trades. In order to be able to, you just need one. Trust me, you just need one sometimes, and it gets the ball rolling.
Again, she stole my answer. So I'm going to kind of piggyback on what was said, and that is telling your story, and telling your story and rebranding how people see your neighborhood, and taking those issue areas and making them into opportunities. And what does that mean? So, for example, we're in Chicago Lawn, and we're working, and they have a huge foreclosure crisis. And they rebrand and they rename, and they take that foreclosure crisis, and it's called Reclaiming Southwest. And what is that about? That's reclaiming Chicago Lawn and reclaiming those homes that were lost to foreclosure. And now they were able to put homes online just by telling that story and rebranding and taking that issue and making it an opportunity. And that gets people attention. It's like marketing, right? But it's how you tell the story. So you could even say, 9 out of 10 people don't do X. Or you can say the one person that did it, and highlight and make that sound so great that people want to buy it. So we have to, rebrand our communities. We have to take those issue areas and turn them into opportunities, and make a pitch to those that have interest in supporting those opportunities, whether it be a foundation, whether it be a business that wants to come to the neighborhood, whether it be the city trying to do a new development. And we have to take those opportunities to rebrand and make those issues into opportunities by retelling a story, but rebranding what we say about the issue.
I agree with all of that, but also I guess I have 2 thoughts that came up listening to your comments. One is that particularly in the housing space and the affordable housing space, a lot of times, in my experience working in communities, the community will say, well, we don't need any more of that. We want to bring more high-end retail, high-end development, and that's our vision for the future. And I think it's our job as planners to do something really difficult, which is to look at that ask from the community and ask yourself, like, where's that coming from? Why is this their vision? And, based on what I know from data and professional judgment, what's my evaluation of that ask and the potential for that to happen? Because I think a lot of times what communities ask for and what they envision is a form of self-esteem, and that's a good thing. But we also need to be active, kind of pushing back and asking those questions, like, well, why do you, let's talk about what tenants in affordable housing developments are bringing to this community. Let's talk about what a new, nicely landscaped multifamily building would do on a prominent block, in a corner that people are driving by all the time. That's a form of investment. Can we think about that for a minute? So kind of encouraging the people to have a frank conversation and assessment about what your assets are and what your opportunities are, and create strategy that can leverage that in creative ways. And we can help that. I think, Kim, this especially goes to your point about telling the story. Before you can even tell the story, you have to think about what the story is like for real. It's and the analysis that we know how to do and the things that we learn along our way can really help planners, help communities go through that kind of discernment process, that once you're on the other side, you can start putting together plans for things that you want to do that could actually practically do something. So there's that piece. And then another thing I wanted to note was that I was talking to a colleague recently who works at one of the statewide housing groups, and he was saying, like, yeah, I just moved to South Shore. Do you know how nice that bungalow I bought is? And do you know how most of the people I meet have never been to South Shore? Mm-hmm. So I think there's also the aspect of kind of being like, okay, we know what we hear on the news, know what we hear on the radio. Among ourselves and in the groups of people we interact with, are we encouraging people just to go places in Chicago, in the region, and see what there is to see? There's no substitute for seeing things yourself. And I find, because I've been to a lot of neighborhoods and communities around the region that don't have, the best reputation in some ways, that there's always something amazing to see, and we need to be telling that story too. Like, have you seen this historic architecture? Like, this one block is amazing, or they have great access to this, or what about this restaurant? And the more we're not closed-minded about places, the more we can help others be kind of open to a more real, full, rich discussion about what places are, because we know that places aren't binary. It's not like a terrible place and a great place, and that's the only kind. It's that everything has its own quality, and that's something to celebrate. So the two things. The twofer. I hear it.
So I totally agree with what you just said, and this is always my challenge to people. Get in your car, get on a train, get on a bike, and come just south of Roosevelt Road. Because there is life on the other side. And you're right, assets that you wouldn't believe. I've had people ask, is Pullman part of the city? It's unbelievable. It absolutely is part of the city of Chicago. But I think so much of what people learn about neighborhoods is from what they see on the news. And oftentimes when you hear about the South Side, it's synonymous with crime, unemployment, and that's just really not our reality. I mean, yes, there's pockets of crime. There's pockets of crime in Lincoln Park. Crime can happen anywhere. So I think it is important, as Kim said, to change our messaging and to really highlight the assets, because all of us that understand the South Side, we recognize all the assets, whether it's the small businesses, whether it's the architecture, whether it's the community engagement and involvement and just strong organized residents, or the block clubs, that are just asking questions and demanding development and demanding equitable, sustainable development. But I mean, the South Side is a gem, and I think we all recognize it, but it's important to tell a friend and tell a colleague. And for me, most importantly, to tell the people that are making funding decisions. So those grants that go out, it's important for those folks that make decisions to come out to the South Side and really see how investment in this neighborhood has attracted additional investment, or the transformative effect that small investment has really made. And I'd like to also say, I think oftentimes when we think about development, we get really excited when we attract these national retailers. And don't get me wrong, it's a win. But I think it's important to also recognize the win that we gain when we attract small businesses. And, you know, with that said, I think it's important for us to support those small businesses. You know, one thing that CNI does, we have a subsidiary that does microfinance. So what that means is they provide loans to small businesses for capital, startup costs, whatever it is, ranging from $5,000 to $50,000. So for your businesses that couldn't typically go to a U.S. bank or a Bank of America and get a loan, they can come to organizations like a CNI or different organizations like that, and it really supports them. And I think that's the conversations that need to be had. Those are the resources that need to be shared. Hey, you mentioned opening a coffee shop. Well, there's a great little neighborhood on the far south side, and they have this really cute 10,000 square foot development, and there's actually one vacant space. Your coffee shop would be so successful. I think you can tell national retailers about leakage, and you could talk about population, but one thing that I found is these small businesses that are from the neighborhood, oh, they know they can be successful in their neighborhoods. They know what's missing. They know that there's a heartbeat in these communities, and I think it's important for those businesses to be supported. While we're working to attract the national tenants, because they're important too, it's equally, if not more important, to make sure that we're supporting those small businesses. And I think that can help to really push economic development. You know, whether it's on a micro level or not, it's economic development.
Okay, thank you. So let's talk a little bit about outside forces that might be shaping a community's ability to affect change for themselves. So how do we go about identifying those outside forces, and then how do we influence them?
I guess I'm a local developer, so I guess I'm inside, if you will. But I think it's important when you know that there's some outside forces going on in a negative way, to continue to check the temperature. I talked about checking the temperature in my early on statements, and to re-engage the community. And, you know, whatever those outside forces are, whether it's foreclosures or whether it's, you know, a lack of investment or joblessness or, you know, unemployment, whatever the thing is, the outside forces, I think it's important to kind of re-engage, talk to the residents, kind of figure out solutions, point residents and community groups into resources. So if it's, you know, this group needs more capacity building, how can we partner with a LISC or with a, you know, Rain Ready program because there's flooding in the area? How can we partner with all these organizations that exist to empower our local residents or empower our local community groups to make them far more resilient to whatever the outside forces may be? But I think a lot of that comes with trust. And I think that whoever that person is that's trying to kind of coordinate these relationships and coordinate the resources, that the residents have to trust them and believe that they're doing it for the right reason. But I think the conversation should happen frequently and should really be ongoing, to be completely honest.
Yeah, I think that this is this question of how do we identify what outside forces are shaping the situation on the ground in communities and work to change it? That's a really, really important role for regional, statewide, and national groups. I can't emphasize enough the importance of ongoing policy research from groups like CMAP, but also like CNT, and other, you know, kind of regional, state, and national partners, because it's essentially what we're working on in the policy group at CMAP, and I know many others approach the work in this way too, is to kind of look at what is happening in communities and look at, you know, kind of a rough estimation of what we think the ideal outcome would be, and try to kind of interrogate that gap and find out why is it that this place or places like it are not getting the resources that are needed? Or are there policies that are being undertaken by like banks and other lenders that are shaping the way capital is distributed throughout the region in a way that's inequitable? So we have there, and it's on everything. We have to look in those domains. We have to look at transportation issues, land use decisions, things about the environment. And by building this kind of large structure of thought about what's going on, what do we think about it, and how would we like to shift it so that outcomes are hitting on those kind of principles that we embrace as planners, communities with high quality of life that have opportunities for people, an environment that is well stewarded. We could all talk all day about what those things are, but I think as a profession, having principles for what healthy communities look like and what good planning looks like helps us while we're looking at the range of things that are going on in terms of policy and on the ground, helps us think about if this is the goal, if this is where we're going, if this is our agreed ideal destination, then that's not happening. Why is it not happening? And what are the easy things and what are the hard things that we need to do to shift the conversation, change the way money's spent, increase regulation, or in some cases decrease regulation. Whatever those levers are, we have to have them. We have to be thinking about them all the time and be in a constant improvement process to try and get the right combination of tools and policies in place so that people who are working on the ground can do what they need to do.
So I think I referenced this in a previous question, but I think it's about having an honest, real conversation, because the reality is for our and underserved communities to improve, outside forces have to come in to be supportive. And I mean, that's the reality of it. But I think the way that you do that is having those honest conversations. And when you know that things are happening or things are changing or something's coming down 2 to 3 years, it's about informing the community. And I think that's based on the relationships that you have. And all of us talked about or spoke on the long-term relationships that we establish in a community. So even though you may not be actively doing a development or creating a plan or working on a project in a neighborhood, you're at these spaces, you're at these tables, and you hear what's going on in the different neighborhoods. So it's about reconvening, reconnecting with individuals to say, hey, I know that this is coming, or these are the conversations that's being had, and have an honest conversation to create opportunity where the community can benefit from it. So for example, and the elephant in the room is the Obama Library coming to Woodlawn, and the community is divided into two. Some people feel positive about it and others feel like it's not really for the community. But it's about, okay, the fact is the library is coming. So it's to work with the community to think about how can we benefit from this library coming? What's the real ask that we're asking for? And educating the community. So how many jobs are you asking for? Being that specific, because if you're not, then it's just gonna fly by and the library's gonna be there and nobody from the community, all the things that they fear will come to. So it's about keeping the community educated, informed, and being honest, and being able to go back and say, process, what can we do differently? What do we have to do to keep this moving forward? And having those tough conversations is not easy, because in all of our communities, you have those individuals who have generations of families that have been invested in the communities we serve. And so, it's emotional, but you have to be supportive of that and understanding of that, but then being honest and realistic about deciding how the community can really benefit when outside forces come in. And then also training for organizing on the front end, because you know that something's coming down, and advocacy and changing policies, working cross-sector to make sure that the community is benefiting from what's happening.
I would venture to take it a step further and state that an outside force is the media. And for your respective community, if you work for a community or in the future end up working for a community where there may be some troubled areas, again, it's changing the narrative. As a planner, you are working to change the narrative for the good. So if sometimes the media wants to latch on to all the bad things that are going on in your respective community. Well, when you have a moment of downtime, you want to try to, again, paint your community in that positive light. Look for ways to get awards and accolades. If you have residents that have started a community garden, put that in a newspaper. Go out and take pictures of that. Put that on the website. Those are things that are positives that need to be broadcasted. Developers look at websites. They look to see if I'm going to relocate to this community, can my employees that are coming with me live there? Can their kids go to school there? What's going on in this respective community? Apply for grants. Work with the public works director. If there's an award for the fastest garbage truck, you need to apply for it and be on it. Seriously, look for ways of getting accolades. Look for ways where your mayor and elected officials can accept an award at a city council meeting. They love that stuff. They may have done nothing to get it. But you want them to accept that. You want pictures. You snap as many pictures as if you're the paparazzi. And you get that on your respective community website, because again, you need to change the narrative. You have to change the narrative. Thinking of ways to outline the positives of your community, the entire community, not the nice parts, the entire community. You have a responsibility to plan for the entire community that we work for, whether you're working for a neighborhood in the city of Chicago or pick a suburban community. It's your responsibility as the planner. So again, think of ways of how to be creative to change the narrative.
And with that in mind, and with some of the comments that have been made, I guess I would just say, if a person is kind of new to the planning just the planning field, it may sound as if this is overwhelming. Am I, as a planner, I'm responsible for getting in contact with the media, coming up with these plans. It may seem overwhelming. So the thing that I wanted to bring to the table is that it's important to make sure that you are aware of partners that have already been in the trenches, kind of working, maybe some of those grassroots organizations, they've already been in the community for years. And so it's important to leverage those sources when we're trying to bring that type of attention, because in a lot of cases, they've already kind of done that work. So I don't want to just put aside the idea of making sure that we have and are connected with partners that have made a difference already within the community, and bringing those resources to them and working with them cooperatively.
Great. So on the other side of the coin, looking inside, going out, what can we do to overcome a community's perhaps mistrust of the planning process and of their local governments in general?
I don't know if anyone else had a comment on that, but I guess I find that quite ironic because I find that a lot of residents, they see these folks, coming with their jackets on, their ties, and they're coming to the community, and they are kind of telling community members, this is what you should do for your community. This is what you should do for your community. We have to understand that a lot of community members, they already have a vision for their community. And so it's important to respect that and to hear that when we go into the actual community to talk to them. We don't want to come with that that perception immediately. And I think that's something that is important when we're trying to build trust. And then too, I think something that I find to be effective is when talking to residents, actually letting them know the benefits of working through that process with the actual local government, seeing the benefits, seeing maybe, for instance, highlighting projects or other things that have been done where the community has worked directly with local officials, and these are key wins that have happened as a result. So then maybe residents, it can change their mindset that, you know, if I do work cooperatively with this group, perhaps this could happen in my community too. So those are just some of the things that I wanted to bring to the table.
I think from the local perspective, the planners can also not come to the meeting with preconceived ideas and telling residents, this is what you need. You have to listen. It goes back to the very first question that you talked about. It's listening. And listening, that is the key, and it's hard. Sometimes you hear stuff, you know it's the professional. This town of 7,000 people is not going to get the next Blackhawks facility. You know this, but it's about listening and taking all of that in and educating them, building trust, showing up, having all these meetings, being present, especially with more and more communities in the Chicagoland area that has lifted residency requirements, and you don't have to reside in the community. It's important for you to become ingrained in that community in different ways. For me, I didn't live in the communities I worked for, but Friday night, I would shop at the grocery store, and people would see me spending my money that their taxpayer dollars is paying me back into the community. I would eat in the community. I would come out on the weekends to events that the community was having. It's those types of ways that you build trust and a connection with the community. Something my grandmother told me years ago when I was a little girl. People are not going to go along with you if they can't get along with you. Simple as that. And so again, it's that wanting to build trust and listening. I think that's just the key, is listening and being present and being sincerely present and actually care about what the residents are saying. That's key.
And so I want to piggyback on the trust issue because I heard a quote and it just resonated with me. And the quote was, people move at the speed of trust. And I'm going to repeat that again. People move at the speed of trust. So that trust building part, that relational part, that being intentional, being honest, those are the things that build trust. If you think about, we have these preconceived notions about the communities that we're in, where, you know, I still live in Austin, but people are like, you live in Austin? Like it's a foreign land. And I'm like, yeah, I live in Austin. They got houses there and I live in a house, you know. But at the same time, you know, if you're coming in that way with that perception, people are not going to trust you. But if you come in truly, authentically trying to learn with the thought in mind that this is how I'm going to build this relation with the people in the neighborhood, in the community, so that, you know, they can get a true, authentic plan, then you understand that the trust building process takes time, and this is what's going to help them to move forward. So to piggyback on, you know, internally, you know, people are people, and every single person in this room is different, and the communities are made up of people like every single person in this room. They're all different, and the people in the communities are different. So you referenced Ms. Jones, who she may want to do a stand-in and say, you're not building on this land. My grandparents' house was here. Where you have somebody else who say, I want to build on this land because your grandparents' house was here. But it's about meeting of the minds. And that takes time. And you have to build trust. And you have to understand that if trust isn't there, you're going to have a plan with no momentum, and it's not going to be implemented because it's going to always be a battle. So it's better to build trust on the front end than the back end.
I think those things are all right on, but another thing I'll note, which is good, takes it in a little bit different direction, is that I think it's okay and even a good idea to acknowledge that the government has not always been a great partner in poor communities and communities of color, and just like front that, you know, it's We know that there are a lot of problems with the way mortgages were written 100 years ago that still deeply shape the reality that people are facing today. So distrust, paranoia, it's not crazy at all. And so if you come to it, with that in your mind, not that any of us created any of those policies, but that's just there. Then I think that that's an important component to having those conversations about what is it that people want and what is it that they're facing, and it's about also following through with people, like when you're having those meetings and conversations and someone asks, like, hey, can you connect me with so and so, or can you send me this information, or can you do this or that? Trustworthy people are people who do what they say they're going to do. And so it's the conversations, it's consistency, and also I do think it's important for us as planners just to be real. Like, the government hasn't always been like amazing, and we don't want to perpetuate policies that drive inequities. We want to solve them and help everything get better, but it's there, and we do ourselves a disservice by pretending that it's not. And that gets into a number of larger issues, which of course are also present, having to do with how people have conversations about power and who makes decisions, and it's real serious. Of course, we all know that, and you have to be thoughtful about it in order to be able to have those conversations. So,
I think to piggyback off what you just said, I think it is important to meet people where they are. And because there's distrust often in communities, don't jump to making a plan. Find out where people really are. It's important. I mentioned this before a few times, to check the temperature of your community and just listen. I think it's so important for stakeholders, residents, to realize you own this plan. And as a developer, it's important for us to go in the community and articulate that. You know your community better than I do. I can't tell you what you should have here. You can tell me what's working and what's not, and we can work together to plan for this. I say it over and over again, it's important to plan with the community and not for a community, because they're the experts, not us. I know land assembly, I can get something through city council, I know the bricks and sticks, but in the financing, but in terms of what this community needs, no one knows it better than the community. And I think articulating that from day one will help you to not have an uphill battle with the community. I think that's how you build trust. And I'll say it time and time again, it takes time. You're not gonna build trust in 3 weeks before the city council meeting. It takes time for the community to realize you are authentic, and this is not just check a box engagement. This group, these developers, these, funders really care about the community. And I think at that point, they're more likely to show up. They're more likely to ask hard questions. And I think most importantly, it's important to have hard conversations and to talk about things that we don't typically talk about. We don't talk about systemic racism that has affected communities, or, strategic disinvestment. I mean, it's important to have these tough conversations so that we can kind of know where we really stand. And I think for us as planners, as developers, I'll say it again, I just said it, to realize who the real experts are. And it's not us, it's them.
So the last question before we open it up to the audience, and maybe the most important, we all know that planning meetings are usually attended by the usual suspects, the Mrs. Johnsons and the Mr. Smiths, right? But how do we get the historically underrepresented groups into the room? How do we get their points of view reflected so that we create plans that are really about the community, for the community, and show the community in the way that it wants to be seen?
Go to where they are. Go to the block club meetings. Maybe you can't address it at one meeting. Maybe it's 20 meetings. Maybe you don't capture an audience of 200 people. Maybe it's that one-on-one where I'm like, I didn't think about it that way. Or your voice is so valuable. Please show up. it's important to articulate that too. It's important to empower folks that have the power to say your voice, your points, they need to be heard. We need to talk to you. Maybe that person doesn't like community meetings. Maybe they don't like their neighbors. Whatever the issue is that keeps them from showing up, it's nothing to keep you from showing up. And I think it's important for us to kind of get out the box, think differently, show up, meet people, I mean, literally in this case, where they are. You know, Ms. Johnson, you've been in the community for a long time. I see you watering your flowers all the time. I never see you, you know, at the community meetings. You normally, this sounds stalkerish, but you're normally watering your flowers in the morning. Can I stop by with a cup of coffee? I want to know what you think. I value your opinion as a long-term resident. That takes time. I guess if you are an authentic developer planner, that time is valuable to you and you realize the importance of those type of conversations. So I think to kind of engage those that are not always at the table, find a new table. Knock on a door, have a 5-minute conversation on their porch if they're comfortable doing so. But I think we'd be remiss if we relied solely on the community meeting that happens on Tuesday afternoon at 5:30, because you're not going to capture all the voices that you really want to hear, if you truly want to hear a variety of voices.
I don't have much to add to that. I think that pretty much covers it. One thing I'll note, though, is that this is a place where data can help us. So when we're doing local planning projects at CMAP, one of the first thing we do is look at the demographic spread, ethnic spread in the community, the age of people, and just try and think, like, who's here and who do we need to talk to? Because the mayor or the client will give you a list of who they think you need to talk to, and we need to have a bigger tent than that. And it's just thinking about that and having it as a principle of how you work in community, that you're going to try to talk to all the different types of people that live in the community, and, you know, as many of them as you can.
So I just want to add, you could look at this as numbers, or the number of people that you get to a meeting, or you can look at the quality conversations that you have. And as you think about, there's different ways to engage media. Someone mentioned social media. I mean, getting input. Someone mentioned social media. Someone mentioned, you know, going to block clubs. And give people a choice, an opportunity of how they want to give feedback. People don't feel comfortable speaking at community meetings. Some people feel like change has moved past them and they give an input and they're going to do what they're going to do. But you need to hear those conversations so that you can know that Ms. Smith or Ms. Jones feels that way, so that you can intentionally keep them engaged. And that's why they're not coming to the meeting. So every time there's an update, however you got to update someone or share the information, whether it's a newsletter or a letter in the mail or a phone call. Phone calls go a long way. One more caveat I want to add to that is leverage your own relationships that you've built, because each person in the community probably knows a lot of more people in the community. And you can build your base by looking at the people that you have relationships with and using them as a resource to get buy-in from others, you know, and then that one person that you know may turn into 5 people that you know. And then you have a champion that can say, well, I know that Tamika is here because she really cares about the community, so you should be involved because of Tamika. And they're involved because they know Liz, you know? And so that's how you get community engagement the non-traditional way. Or you could just put out a flyer and say, come to a meeting. And then, you know, it's 3 weeks before city council and you said, we have 50 people at this meeting. But that's not true, authentic community engagement. So.
With respect to your comment about leveraging those relationships, you can't leverage what you don't have, planners. You've got to take these shows on the road. Just meet them where they are. There was an example for me. I had a small Hispanic population in a community I once worked for that would never participate, and we needed to get feedback. I would always grab lunch from this little taco place, not realizing the owner knew everybody. One Sunday, I had to drive out to the suburbs to have this conversation because you had a critical mass of people there after church. And that was the population of people I needed to talk to in order to garner their feedback. So again, it's sometimes you got to take these shows on the road and forego certain things for your job in order to get your job done. So again, it's everything they said. Plus, again, thinking about creative ways to engage these particular stakeholders because they're just as important as those like the Ms. Johnsons that will show up for any meeting. So it's important.
I was just thinking when you talk about I feel that you have to understand how the community communicates. So, for instance, are there a number of maybe Facebook pages or groups is that the way that they communicate? Is there a local radio station? I mean, there are different ways. You just have to be a little more innovative to understand how the community actually communicates. And then I think one area that we don't typically tap into, I find as planners, when you talk about going out to some of the community events or having meetings, sometimes, like you said, hearing the term meeting, people shy away. It sounds too formal, too technical. So a lot of times, I know when I think about communities that have representative groups, including children, a lot of times we don't necessarily tap into that resource. School children, parents, maybe getting engaged and maybe going to actually some events that involve school children. Sometimes we'll go to the district and maybe talk to someone, the superintendent, but actually getting involved in the trenches to see who those groups might be. So that might be an opportunity to engage more underrepresented groups and to reach more people. And like you said, a lot of times we have to do this work. If you want to be effective and a real leader, it's not just about, I work from 9 to 5. You have to take things a step further. You have that passion. You really want to help the community. And so sometimes you might have to, after work or on the weekend, to be engaged, to understand the community. But that will bring better results to the community and also even help you in your own career with just broadening your career, having more experience, understanding the community. And so don't think of it as the short term. Think of it as long term of how you can kind of bridge that gap too.
Thanks. So I think now we're ready to take audience questions. Katanya, if you would like to take the mic, and then we can repeat the questions. This is Katanya, Emerging Planner of the Year for APA.
Thank you. Anybody ready for a question?
I appreciate everybody talking like it was very much narrowed in on an individual community or finding a neighborhood. Dealing with maybe from the regional perspective, when you're trying to deal with a whole region, how do you get the diversity across a whole region? I can't go to every taco stand. I can't go to every church group when you're dealing with, thousands of people or 50 communities that you're trying to engage. So what were suggestions you'd have for engaging across a large corridor or a large multi-jurisdictions?
So the question is, how do we do community engagement that's representative across a regional scale or a larger multi-jurisdictional scale?
I seriously think you should answer this question, Katanya.
Okay, I'll try to tackle it, and please. Hi, everybody. My name is Katanya Raby, and I work for CMAP. I am one of the outreach planners at CMAP, and so a lot of my work involves going out into communities, just like what you were saying, going across the region and speaking to people about what we do at CMAP. And it is difficult. It is not easy to get out and go to every taco location. You can't. But what you can do is be strategic in the way that you make your planning for appearances. So you kind of narrow down what topics you're trying to cover. And then you start making those connections. You still have to connect with those key people in those communities so that you know who you need to talk to initially to get to a larger audience. So you kind of, just like in a community like Ciara was talking about, how it could take up to a year to really kind of get the word out about whatever it is you're doing. When you're doing regional planning, it's the same thing. It might be even longer. For this engagement that we've been doing for the On to 2050 plan at CMAP, it's been a 2-year process for us to get a lot of the input towards that plan. And so we've just been doing as much as we can as far as connecting with individual key stakeholders and big time players in these different communities around the region. And then they connect us to other community groups that we should go and get additional information from. And we set up these public workshops. We go to where they are. That's really important. So we plug ourselves into standing meetings and different events, festivals, anywhere that people are already, large amounts of people ideally. That's kind of what we've been doing. So different counties have county fairs. We'll show up there. We are creative in the way that we get our input. We do it in different kinds of ways so that it's accessible on different levels. Thinking about our digital ways of collecting information via online surveys, or taking an iPad out to a festival, having sticky notes and sticking them on a board, so that there's all of these different touch points or different ways that people can share their concerns or ideas for their community. So it takes a whole lot of what these ladies have already stated, and a lot of willingness to put your boots to the ground and getting out there. And being strategic about the area so that you can cover as much as you can. It's impossible to get 8.5 million people, get input from 8.5 million people. You're just not going to do it. So being okay with getting a subset of that, but trying to be, smart, and getting as much of a thank you. A representative sample of the region is very important. That's the best way that you can go about doing that. I hope I answered that. Anybody else you want to? Okay. I didn't expect to be on the panel.
You did a great job.
Thank you.
This question might apply more to planners that play a consulting role rather than who are like a CNI who's embedded in a community and is there long term. But there's often a mismatch between the pace of neighborhood change and a planning process, be it 1 year, or I think you mentioned yours might be up to 18 months. How do you reconcile that? You know, as a consultant planner, you are hired either by the government or your client to solve a challenge, and you have a year to do that, or 6 months, or whatever the time frame is. And neighborhoods, you know, that, for example, at the UIC Urban Forum a few weeks back here, one of the panelists said, just sit down and shut up for 5 years and listen. And that'd be great if you had 5 years that you could shut up and listen, but that's not the process or the tempo of a planning process. So how do you reconcile the neighborhood change with the planning process?
So to summarize that question, we talked a lot about how we need to be in a community long-term and have those relationships, but sometimes we have a contract that says we have to deliver in a much shorter time period. So how do we do that? How do we accomplish it but still have plans that are truly engage the community and also represent the community?
I can give a really brief. So while we have a holistic approach in Pullman, we do plan, develop in other neighborhoods. And so what we rely on with other neighborhoods, because we don't have maybe a whole year, the grocery store has to be built, we rely on the relationships there and the strong community groups that are there. And we listen to them, and not just one of them, but as many as you can. And we show up for meetings to say, hey, here's what we were thinking based off what we've heard from the strong community groups that are here. Is this right? Are we kind of thinking of this right? And we allow them to give us the feedback. So I think to kind of answer that from my experience is we rely heavily on the relationships that exist already. Not just one relationship, but multiple relationships, because it allows us to get different perspectives.
I was thinking the same thing. It's really important that maybe you have a 6-month process. So when you start that process, you go down the list, you identify stakeholders, that's kind of part of the process, but you find those groups, those community groups immediately as the initial part of your scoping process, so that you understand who you need to go to be able to kind of leverage that with the time that you need. They've already been there. They've already been in the trenches, whether it be a non-for-profit, whether it be a community organization, a church. They've already been, and they know a lot of the issue that already exists. So it's really important to kind of do your homework to understand who those players are from the beginning of the process, and that perhaps will cut down on time that you don't have for that planning process.
Also, once upon a time, I served as a consultant, planning consultant. And there was a particular project in which the community didn't have a planning community development department. So they didn't have that staff that you could kind of rely on when you've got to get in and get out, so to speak, on an 8-month contract. And again, it's trying to obtain the best representative sample of that particular community. And a lot of times you have a short period of time to try to obtain that, and that comes with a lot of data, a lot of research, trying to do a lot of that upfront research prior to, once you hear about this contract, trying to do a little bit of that work beforehand to find out who do I reach out to in the absence of working for a community of 3,000 without a community development department, and having to shepherd along these types of projects. So it's, again, being creative. Relying upon those networks and stakeholders based on what you've previously heard from these ladies, but also when you have to be the Lone Ranger to get in and get out as a consultant, is you have to be inventive to try to, again, we're not expecting you to make magic, but representative sample to try to make the process as equitable as possible.
Thank you all for your comments so far. They've been great. I kind of have a hard question. In your work, have you had to work, because we're talking about equity, and there are people who are never going to approximate that middle class ideal that we all want everyone to have. Have you encountered having to plan for people who live in deep poverty, have criminal records, like the truly vulnerable? And how have you gone about that?
So the question is, how do we plan, or have we, and how do we plan for populations that are below the poverty line, that are very vulnerable in the community?
And again, so LISC we create plans and support neighborhoods with plans. We're not an actual urban planning entity. We usually bring in planners. We partner with CMAP on one of the plans in our other neighborhoods. We contract out and hire planners. But I will say that majority of our neighborhoods have some level of individuals that have very complex social challenges, whether it be poverty or unemployment or underemployment or criminal records. And, there are champions in each of those respective areas in the neighborhood. So as we're thinking about a plan, we want those champions who are in the neighborhood at the table planning with us, as well as the individuals whose lives are going to be impacted by this plan. So, and then the community gets to select their priority areas based on data that we share, or data that they may already have, or that good qualitative data that they know that we may not know from the outside. And they get to say what the focus areas are of this plan. And again, we're creating comprehensive plans through LISC, so it may not be particular to a grocery store or affordable housing complex. That's all involved in our plans, but we want to make sure that you know, even if those individual place-based activities are happening, that the community is benefiting from it. So there may be an opportunity to first creating jobs through this. You know, as we talked about the Walmart in Pullman, you know, it created a lot of jobs for the neighborhood. And then also making sure that those jobs are for the people that live there. So making sure that if this development is happening, that they may be willing to hire ex-offenders or returning citizens. So that's how we look at it from LIST perspective. It's like the community decides, you know, and it's about, again, meeting people where they are. So not everybody is going to be job ready. So when these opportunities come, it's about getting them job ready. So there may be a job training center that we want to get people to when we know developments are coming to the neighborhood.
Yes. I want to build on what you were saying. It makes me think about the plan that we're working on in Lawndale. I have some just like specific things to mention. One, I think most communities in some way are economically mixed. Even when there are large shares of people living in deep poverty, that's usually not 100% of people, and that's important to acknowledge too. And when we start thinking about what are the structural issues that are impacting, let's say, for instance, people who have housing choice vouchers. We know, for instance, from data analysis in Lawndale, that after the foreclosure crisis, there are a lot of entities that do not have their taxes, you know, registered in the community that were buying cash apartment buildings there, and a lot of those entities are now renting to voucher families. And it's a known thing in the community that not all of these landlords are good neighbors. So how do we think about policies that can help community members? You know, a typical housing form in Lawndale is a 3 or 4 flat. So how can you help people maybe live in one unit and rent the other 3 to neighbors with a voucher or otherwise? Like, what are the practical steps that we can take that will open doors and provide opportunities for people, even people, you know, living in pretty severe poverty, to have a good quality of life and be at home in the place where they live? You know, and it's a lot of, I think, interventions at that level rather than like one grand idea on how we can address things for this group.
I think also from an economic development perspective at the municipal level, when communities give out funding for businesses to relocate to the community, particularly using the economic development instrument TIF, you hold them to that. I gave you money. We want you to create jobs. In my former position with the negotiation of Clarks from Georgia to the Village University Park, we provided them with a lot of TIF incentive. Initially, they were going to bring 180 jobs, well-paying jobs to the community. We put in that redevelopment agreement that residents will have first dibs on that. Well, how are we going to ensure that residents were able to take on these skilled jobs? I was able, having a colleague met at an event such as this, a professor who worked for the Governor State University, who still works for Governor State University, I was able to get a meeting through her with the president of the university to say, hey, we've got this deal on the table. If we're able to be successful with these 180 jobs, if we get you their skilled curriculum, would you be able to provide the training? We pay you from the TIF district to host the training. It's a win-win. They said, yeah. We went back to Clark's and told them, we're going to give you this money. You're going to create these 180 jobs. You have to agree to hiring residents of the community first, in which we had 15% unemployment for a town of under about 6,000 people. They said, we'll bring 200 jobs if you can solidify that deal. We were able to get 200 jobs, in which over 50% of those jobs were held by residents of the village. So it's again using those tools and holding these people accountable to those types of things to create opportunities for residents who are unemployed and or underemployed.
So I want to see how, like, what your opinion or how you guys would go about kind of addressing academia, planning schools, but also the profession, and perpetuating kind of the division between, perpetuating maybe sometimes segregation, but also just planners. So like planners of color, and then, planners who have maybe been in the field for a long time and aren't necessarily, planners of color, and then kind of trying to figure out what our role as planners of color would be to address kind of that division. So, whether it be in academia, having a curriculum that is not representative of either the student body or the communities of color that exist within any given city or location, but also even having like planning firms that are trying to plan in communities of color and then just add either some person who speaks Spanish or a person of color, and it almost seems like they're just adding them on as a token, but not necessarily bringing them along because of the skill sets that they have or the experiences that they have as a person of color. So what is the role of planners in calling that out and addressing that?
Yeah. It's a great question. Yeah. So I think if I'm understanding correctly, it's really more about the profession of planning and having planners who reflect our communities, who are part of firms and agencies long term, who are developed at the same level as any other planner professionally. How do we sort of shift our profession so that we're really reflecting the communities that we're planning in?
But also like academia, because I think it's important that since that's where we're getting our education, and if we're not having an education that's comprehensive and that, one class on feminism or one class on communities of color isn't enough, or it doesn't give a planner coming out of school the credentials to say that, yeah, they can operate and work well in a community of color.
So none of us are academics, but sort of what do we see maybe as the gaps in academia that would really qualify planners to work well in communities of color? Is that okay?
So I think my bio said I went to U of I. Actually did UIC's program, and I loved the program. It's in the city of Chicago, but one thing I used to always argue is how come we're not studying more about Southside? And I know that you can only cover so much in a class, but one thing that I would argue is we need classes on disinvested communities, a whole class, not a chapter, but a whole class on how to tackle it, how to address it, whether you're on the community development side, the economic development side, the environmental sustainability side, the transportation planning side. It affects all areas. So I'd argue that on the academic side. In terms of in your field, I actually just had this conversation with someone earlier this week. Oftentimes in rooms, I'm often the only person of color, and often the only woman in certain rooms. And, I've only been in the field for 4 years, so I'm, I guess, fairly newer to this field. And initially when I started off, I was always hesitant to go against the grain. I would get home and I would, be so angry at myself for not speaking up and saying, I disagree with that and I don't think it works that way. Now, I think I realize how valuable my voice is. And how unique my perspective may be. I'm from the South Side, I live on the South Side, I work on the South Side, I shop on the South Side. So I think in meetings, I have a perspective that maybe others in the room don't have, and I need to articulate that and be comfortable articulating that. And so I think my charge to planning students is realize how valuable your voice is, and your perspective is so unique, it needs to be shared. Luckily, I'm working for an organization that shares my values. I'm working for an organization that's very mission driven and realizes that Southside neighborhoods deserve quality service, deserves good retail, deserves these things that all the other neighborhoods north of Roosevelt Road have. But you're not gonna always be in a room of like-minded people, so it's important to respectfully push back when you hear things that just don't feel right, or when people say things that you are like, that is ridiculous. And so whether it's finding your voice, whether it's getting your confidence, whatever the thing is, I think it's important to be comfortable being uncomfortable.
I have one small note, which is that I think at the planning school here at UIC, the students have a pretty good history of putting together programs to promote the type of learning that they want to see that's not happening in the classroom through the Urban Forum and other kind of student-led initiatives. So if there are gaps, I say, to point at that gap and start thinking with your colleagues and professors about how to fill it. And maybe it'll result in a change to curriculum. I would take that class. Or, something. We have to be creative on thinking about how to meet gaps. But also, there's a lot of we're lucky as planners that there are a lot of opportunities for us to keep learning through our careers. And the more people ask to have these types of conversations, the more they'll take place, I think.
Yeah. I would just add, if you're in a room and you don't feel comfortable, when you leave that room, still communicate and express your ideas via email, or do a follow-up phone call, do a one-on-one meeting, and be able to share with whomever, whatever made you uncomfortable, because your voice is valid and it needs to be heard. And sometimes you are in spaces where, you know what you know because you are from where you're from, and you're kind of the expert because you live it every day. But make sure that you communicate afterwards to be able to get your message in there. In every meeting, there may or may not be an opportunity, but seize the opportunity after the meeting to still express yourself.
I am also an alum of the planning program, the master's planning program here. And as far as academia, that's a very difficult question. It's understanding that a lot of your professors aren't necessarily practicing planners. They're professors. They've always been in the world of academia. And I loved the program when I was here, but realistically, a lot of the classes I took, let me backtrack. Planning, when you get out of school, is going to be very different than what you learned in school. That's just what it's about. So I would say being a planner of color, typically being the only planner of color in a lot of rooms that I'm in, it's about working with the program and within the program to let them know how important that is. They're just not, having once been the chair of the state diversity committee, there's just not a lot of planners of color. And those of us that do get degrees in planning, a lot of us tend to practice non-traditional planning, so to speak. We're not the typical municipal planner. Demand more in the sense that these community planning studios that I believe that's a part of the curriculum have more practicing planners and reaching out to these planners of color, to have them come in and talk about tales from the trenches. That's what it should be called. Tales from the trenches of what's really going out here and what's really going on. Second, you read my mind. I had this conversation earlier this week with someone too. For your current and future, whether you create your own consulting firm, you run one, whatever, it is insulting to some communities of color for a consultant agency to show up with that one person of color because they may speak Spanish and or be African American or Asian or whatever, not white, and show up for that meeting. So many residents find that insulting. I've been doing this for 17 years. I'm not that old, but I've been doing that for 17 years in the profession. And I have found, working as a consultant and working as a municipal planner and working with consultants as a municipal planner, I hear that more often than not that they find that insulting. What's more impressive, when I was the chair of the diversity committee for the state chapter of APA, I would tell people all the time, these diversity conversations are more for you, not me. I'm a person of color, I get it. They're more for the non-minority planner. Because majority of the time, it's gonna be a white planner working for a minority, predominantly minority, or half minority community. And being able to navigate that particular world is important. And I think that people of color find it more impressive when someone who's not them, who does not look like them, understand where they come from, can understand. You may not be able to relate, you may not have grown up the same way, but to be able to be sympathetic and have an ear and actually be sincere about the issues that are going on and actually want to assist with change, whatever your role is in that particular community. So I agree with you wholeheartedly about that. Some communities find it disrespectful for that one token minority planner to show up. As a planner, you know, you have to navigate these particular worlds. I've worked in a consulting firm like that, and I ended up leaving because I did not want to be that one token. Even though there's not a lot of African American planners, more when I started 17 years ago in the program, I'm seeing more and more of them now, and it makes me happy and I smile. But nonetheless, I want my non-minority planners to also want to be a part of that. I recently just spoke with a colleague, an old colleague of mine, who out in the south suburbs posted for a director position in his predominantly African American community, and he posted on the state chapter's website, he's planning.org, did not get one planner to apply to it. A director position. I'm like, he called me, what is going on? I know there's tons of planners that would love to be a director. It makes you wonder, why didn't anybody apply to it? We got lawyers, and he said a pet shop owner applied to it. He's gotten all these crazy resumes. He's like, Kim, do I repost? What's going on? Did something change and I not know about it? It makes you wonder. I know there are tons of white planners that want their next step to be a director. Why was there a hint? The salary is really good, 6 figures. What is the hindrance? What was the trepidation? What was the fear of applying for that particular position? Why is it that you tend to find when you do have a minority planner, those are the only ones that are working in these minority communities? So these are greater conversations that we have to challenge. You know, again, diverse is not for us, we get it. It's for you and it's for everybody. As a planner, we are responsible. And what is the fear? And if you don't know, find out. I've met planners who tell me, well, I've never been on the South Side. Well, shame on you. Shame on you. How are you in the city of Chicago with 77 different neighbors? Still 77, right? Yeah. 77 different neighbors. I want to make sure. 77 different, and you haven't been to all of them. Get on the bus, get on your bike, get on the car. If you're afraid, get up, go in the wee hours in the morning. Get out there and explore and see what's out there. You're gonna get me upset. I'm gonna have to let this mic go.
The only thing that I wanted to mention, it might be intimidating,
Yeah.
you know, for someone who maybe they've never been to a specific area of town. So I think it's valuable to have that peer-to-peer relationship. So you work with other planners. You ask another planner, and maybe you talk about some of the tough issues. And so in that way, you can kind of that's someone you're comfortable with. Mm-hmm. So it's important to kind of use that network too, and to not overlook that when we're trying to tackle that issue.
Mm-hmm.
So we're out of time, but I just want to put in a plug for the Diversity Committee, because our mission is both to support planners from diverse backgrounds in their professional development, but then also to help all planners work more effectively in communities in which they are not necessarily a part of for one reason or another, whether that be a community of color or a poorer community or an LGBT community, what have you. We all have something that's different about us from the community we're in. So I encourage you to join our committee and get involved with our programs, and hopefully we can find some ways to maybe even work with school curricula and diversify that. Thank you for coming.